Learn to pin baste a quilt with me during part 6 of the Glow Quilt-along. Basting is the process of temporarily attaching the 3 or 2 layers of your quilt together before you sew them together. For the puff quilt version, we're going to start with 2 layers of fabric only. You're laying down your backing fabric first, the right side of the fabric facing the floor. Using painter tape or weights, you're going to stretch out the fabric until it's taut. Start taping at the seam line or the center fold of your fabric on those edges. Slowly tape around the entire piece of fabric, getting out all the wrinkles. Pulling your fabric taut, but not distorting your fabric. I avoid taping my corners first because that can pull your fabric into some wonky angle. Also pick a hard surface that you're okay with potentially scratching with your pin. Next, lay out your quilt top and carefully go around and press it out with your hands. We don't need to tape down this layer. The fabrics will naturally hold each other in place. Really take your time with this step because it's going to make a big difference as to how nice and flat your quilt's going to end up. We're going to grab our pins for basting. So the pins that we used when quilt basting are slightly curved, which helps get them through the multiple layers of fabric. I like to just dump mine out onto the center of the quilt, and then I start from the center going outwards while I'm basting, and this, in my opinion, helps keep everything flat and in place. So as I'm basting, I'm just taking my time, making sure that the pin's going through all 2 or 3 layers, depending on if you're doing a puff quilt or a traditional quilt, and I'm pressing the fabric out gently each time. I like to place my pins about a hand width apart or around 5 to 6 inches apart. There's no real hard and fast rule around this, but you want to make sure that the fabric's not going to be moving around while you're sewing. It's also useful to think about where you're placing your pins in relation to where you're going to be sewing. In this case, I know I'm going to be sewing along the seam lines, so I'm placing my pins in the center of each strip, which is going to allow me to, at times at least, be able to keep sewing without taking away the pin every time I come by one. Also, I should note that the Art Gallery Fabrics pattern for this quilt calls for using 2 pieces of fabric sewn together to make the backing fabric, which is the yellow fabric that you're seeing on the bottom there. Because of the width of my quilt top, I was able to just use 1 piece of fabric. If your quilt top is wide enough that you need 2 pieces of fabric, you can sew together your 2 pieces of fabric using a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch seam and iron out that seam and then place that seam in the center of where you're going to be placing your top fabric. If this is your first quilt, it's easier to do it with a wider backing piece of fabric so you have more wiggle room. So I would suggest sewing those 2 pieces of fabric together and then using that as your back. Also, you can see this process takes some time. It's a really good moment to pull out that great podcast or audiobook that you've been listening to. I've got Midnights playing by Taylor Swift. Make it as enjoyable of an experience as you can. To reduce fabric movement while sewing, I like to think about what direction I'm placing my pins. You can see I started placing them all going horizontally, but I actually realized that I should have had them going vertically because that's going to reduce the amount of movement of fabric. To pin baste for a traditional quilt instead of a puff quilt, you're going to want to place your batting over top of your backing fabric and then place your top fabric. I found that the 60 by 60 throw was a great size for this quilt. I'm using the 60 by 60 throw for this quilt, which I found was a great size, and I'm not washing it before I use it. While laying your batting out over top of your backing fabric, you're going to want to take your time to make sure that you reduce any wrinkles. And if there's any really tough spots, you can pull that over to your ironing machine. And I like to just place a tea towel or a piece of quilting cotton between my iron and the batting. I just find that it works a bit better that way. And then you can get those tough spots out. In this spot, what I'm doing is using the center fold of the fabric and lining that up with, the center fold of the batting and lining that up with my backing fabric just to make sure that there's going to be lots of space. And then I'm just going around and pressing it out. I was lucky with this batting that it was pretty wrinkle-free. There weren't any tough spots. So I'm just taking my time, going around, making sure that's all flat. For the batting, you also do not need to tape this on top. It will just sort of hold there itself with the nice friction between the 2 different fabrics. Once you have your batting nicely laid out and you're feeling good about how flat it is, you're going to grab your quilt top and lay that out over top of the batting. Especially if you have any patterning on your backing fabric, you really want to make sure that you're lining up your quilt top properly. And a way to do that is to make sure that the center line of of your top fabric is lined up with the center line of your backing fabric. And you can create a center line in your top fabric just by simply folding the fabric over and creating a crease. So what I'm doing here is pressing the fabric out and also checking to make sure that I have the backing fabric and the top fabric aligned and the backing fabric is showing out beyond the top fabric. You always want to make sure that your backing fabric and your batting are wider than your quilt top, because this is going to make sure that you don't end up in a situation where you have to cut your quilt top smaller at the end of this process because the backing fabric and the batting are shorter than the top fabric. So I'm just checking again to make sure that the edges are going to be overlapping properly. I've got room where I've got more backing fabric than top fabric, and I'm just pressing it all out. And now that that's done, we're going to use those same pins and start pinning from the center out. Whether I'm doing this for the glow quilt without the batting or for a traditional quilt, I always like to start at the center and just keep pressing the fabric and the batting out as I go. I usually work towards one side of the quilt to start, and then I work my way towards the other side. If you are able to do this on a large table or even a small table, you can actually do this with a half-size table and move your fabric once you're halfway down your quilt. It's a lot easier on your back. You will find if you've never quilted before, it's actually kind of a strenuous experience when you are doing your basting. And you can see here that I'm placing my pins going vertically instead of horizontally because I realized while I was basting the puff quilt version that that would be a lot better for reducing fabric movement while I'm sewing. If you're new to quilting, the actual step of quilting, which I'm referring to as sewing just to be less confusing, the quilting is actually when we use our sewing machine and we create the stitches that are attaching the 3 layers of the quilt together. So the quilt is the actual end product, and quilting is the process of sewing multiple layers of fabric together to create your quilt. So once again, just take your time during this process. Quilting really builds on each step. So if you rush through one step and it's a bit wonky, then the next step is just going to be harder. Now, that being said, quilts don't need to be perfect. There are wrinkles in all of my quilts. It's okay. I mean, I'm always trying to reduce them and I'm always trying to be a perfectionist about it, but it's all right. It doesn't have to be perfect for it to be beautiful. So you can see I've pinned on this side and I'm going to start moving to the next side, and also that I do not know how to use my camera properly, but the whole thing's pinned now. So what I'm going to do is I cut off the excess batting and I'm going to take off all of that tape, and then I'm going to be ready to show you next week how to quilt the quilt together so that we can move on to doing the binding and your quilt will be all done.